Welcome to Kali Tribune podcast. In this podcast, we'll talk about some new tendencies in philosophy, but after a very long introduction. The reason is the customary rule we apply on Kali Tribune. That is that deviation should be explained on the basis of exemplar that it deviates from. Assumption, of course, being that everything has an exemplar and that every deviation is deviation of something. There is no deviation in itself. Now, people sometimes ask me about nominalism, a philosophical ideology, I would say, because once you add ism to something, I would say you are rather talking about political standpoint than originally metaphysical. And philosophy, secular, almost secular already, Middle Ages philosophers like William of Ockham, to whom name the term nominalism is customarily connected, could not really be subsumed under nominalism proper to how the nominalism is applied as a kind of strategy today, intellectual strategy. So I won't talk about William of Ockham and his followers or his predecessors, because this is a separate, highly, I would say, professional issue for philosophers. Philosopher, you have to go into details to do justice to your subject. Whereas when you take nominalism as it is used today, you are talking about the usage of a term. And I'll say a few words about it now. Just to remind our readers, there was a lot of talk about nominalism in this sense of Kali Tribune. Maybe it's not really up to date anymore. A few years have passed. But I talked about nominalism as a political correctness, as a moral nominalism. Here we'll talk about nominalism just as a launching pad for something that goes beyond, that is to say, below nominalism and below materialism in contemporary thought and contemporary intellectual climate. Because intellectual climate is a very popular term nowadays, so I don't call intellectual fashions intellectual climates. There is something very up-to-date about this term. Today, intellectual climate, in my opinion, is following the historical tendency of Western societies, let's say Western in somewhat qualified pejorative sense. The tendencies that are in fact trying to go beyond traditional means of destruction of metaphysics, and nominalism is one of those, was used as one of those means to destruction of not only metaphysics but tradition in general, because tradition, of course, is something far more than metaphysics. Metaphysics is a science, in fact, a science in a quite qualified sense, not in the modern sense of the word, but I will not go too far into that because I mentioned it many times before and explained what I mean by it. Now, let us start from exemplar. Let us start from the standpoint from which we can, I think, understand these tendencies and this intellectual atmosphere. So let us talk about what is knowledge, how knowledge comes about in a traditional understanding, where I would extract and extrapolate 3 steps. Although taking the steps as in this formalized way is just a way to speak about something that is in itself continuous. Well, these 3 steps would be called in this podcast being, the second would be logos or intentio, and third would be name. That is to say, this is the progression of knowledge. Progression that is always present in act of knowledge to some extent. At least first two steps, and at the very, very least the first step. Without the first step, there is no knowledge. And the first step is being. I didn't say knowledge of being. And this is very important, not easy to understand, so I'll try my best to relate it. Now, what is being? By being, here I use what in Greek we would call on, more precisely on heon of Aristotle, being qua or being as being, or ens in Latin scholastics, and generally Latin language tradition. This is very important to bear in mind, because being is not to be identified in this sense with some different aspects of this word can be used in, like essence, essentia, or esse, which is act of being. I don't know how to translate this properly in English. It's something that is, in fact, translation, that is to say, transposition of Greek term energeia. And it's not the same as the being. It is component of being. It is present in being, but in a special sense. Now, this being, I would posit, is a presence that is present in every act of knowledge. So every act of knowledge is the knowledge of being, act of knowledge of being. Now, what this means? This, let's say what it does not mean, and the best way to explain what it does not mean is try to criticize it from a modern standpoint, because in modernity, especially in Kant's philosophy, you have this germ of criticism of the notion of being, that is to say, destruction of it. An attempt to show that being is in fact flatus vocis, empty sound, empty voice, an empty name, something that nominalists, by the way, would agree wholeheartedly with. And why is that? Well, the being presupposes that whenever we say something is, we are in fact explicating a mode of being. Now, when you take, for instance, a thing that is not living, a living thing, thinking thing, and so on, they are all beings. What is one among them is that they are beings, but they are in a different way. And originally, this understanding of being presupposes, this traditional understanding presupposes hierarchy. So being is not neutral. When I, for instance, predicate somebody, let's call you Jozo, this is a male name in Croatian. Jozo is a man. I'm explicating, because predication is explication, not signification. Let us be clear about this. I'm explicating a certain identity, a certain indivision existing in Jozo. This indivision is the being of Jozo. The being of Jozo is that he is a man, because it is also his essence. This is what differentiates him from other beings. Now, this differentiation between various individual beings would be impossible without the presence of being, of universal being. That there is something in them that makes them one unified being. Not in the sense that this one unified, mind you, one unified being is a kind of one thing above all other things, but something else, and I will shortly try to explain what this something else is. Let us try to think contrarily, negatively, and deviantly. Let us try to think Yozo in isolation, to start from individual. How then would Yozo be differentiated from others? At the first sight, one has the impression that if you start from these individual beings, you kind of like don't need this universal being. And this is what Kant, to some extent, taught. But then something happened to Kant. Namely, Kant's philosophy, Kant's, that is to say, introductory act of transcendental philosophy called Critique of Pure Mind, was based on the premise, that is to say, it was based, as he thought, on intuition, infallible intuition, mind you, of mind understanding its own faculties. And one very important thing for mind is that those faculties and their objects are unified. Now, what this means? In Kant's philosophy, everything that can be known is an appearance. That is to say, it has to appear to subject, because Kant's philosophy is built on the discrepancy or the cleavage between subject and object. Excuse me, that was a phone going off. We can continue. Now, what is this rift, let's call it, between subject and object? Mainly this. Kant understood, or that is to say, believed that the necessary knowledge, that is to say, knowledge that entails axioms of natural sciences, more precisely geometry and mathematics, that are, in his opinion, the building blocks of other sciences, and also some principles of physics in a Newtonian sense of mechanics, are such that cannot be extracted from the experience, because experience doesn't yield causality in necessary way. This might seem strange, but as far as I can see, by following modern philosophy of science as much as I have time to and inclination, because it never really interested me, this is very much the notion even today, because science doesn't deal with causality so much as it deals with laws of nature. And law and causality are not the same thing. And nominalism can tell you a lot about it, because laws are very important for nominalism. So in Kant, however, there is this attempt to solve the problem how we cannot have permanent causal relations in nature. We are not able to observe them. That is to say, we are able to observe causality, but only in a finite way. Yet we have eternal laws, as he thinks, infinitely valid eternal laws. Well, simply because they are the form of subject. They are the forms of not only cognition, but also of the constitution of the object of cognition, in the widest possible sense. That is to say, they are the unified form of subject and object relation. So the world is a unity of subject and object in some sense. And this sense is the forms of subjective, that is subjective perception, that are space and time, and categories of reason. But the thing that really makes all this experience, because in Kant we are not talking about things in themselves, we are talking about experiences of things in themselves, but we don't experience them as they are in themselves, but only as they appear to knowing subject. So things are in itself something he calls noumenon, following bastardized understanding of Plato, are something that is really, in a strict sense, beyond, not transcendent, only beyond. They are beyond our knowledge, they are beyond our experience, they are beyond phenomenal world. Now, this is very new form of thinking, modern form of thinking. It is very subtle, it is very deep, in a sense, it is very deviant in a morally neutral way from the exemplar. Now, to remind, I'm talking about how Kant rejects this notion that being is all present in everything. He nevertheless considers that there is something that unifies all things, and that something is an act, a synthetic act of apprehension, as he calls it. Synthetic act of apprehension is a subjective synthesis, but ability of the subject to synthesize its own forms, in which he knows the world and in which the world is constituted as the totality of phenomena. Now, what is this? This is what Kant calls transcendental I, sometimes, or transcendental apperception. So, whereas he rejects being as the purely logical regulatory principle, when you say everything is being, you are merely saying tautology, you are making an analytic judgment, as he would call him, from his peculiar understanding of what analysis means. You are saying nothing. It's obvious that everything is being, but being does nothing to anything. But what does something to everything is subject, because he is doing the act of synthesis. And this synthesis is, among other things, revealed in judgments. So you cannot really come to understand that everything is synthetical, that everything is unified, without power of making judgments. So being in Kant is also present, but it is present as a subjective act, transcendental act, not yours or mine, but act in general. By the way, I talked and wrote about Kant. You can refresh your knowledge about him from some of the videos and articles we did, and you can very easily find them if you browse the web page or the YouTube channel. So I'm not going to go too deep into Kant because we don't have time. We have to run forward. What I want to show here is Kant rejects the name of being. Frankly, rejects one of the what Dionysia Areopagita would say, names of God, but he retains its function and gives it to something else. He doesn't give it merely to man, he gives it to rational subject, not self-interested rational subject of liberals, but a kind of underlying subject of all, that is consciousness. And consciousness is this act of synthesis of subject and object. And you know, I mean, on most mundane level, when you connect subject and object, you do also, this is something you do in sentence also. But in Kant, being becomes something else, but it is still present. And in order that we would understand individual things, any individual thing, we have to understand it in communion with other things. Because no discrete thing can exist for itself. Being absolutely discrete thing would mean absolutely quantified thing, would be only a number, and we'll get back to this. This is very interesting. So there is a very difference, otherness among things. What in Latin was called aliquid, and was in scholastic a transcendental, needs being. But in Kant's sense, it needs subjective synthesis of experience, synthesis of knowledge, which is at the same time the synthesis of world that can be known. Let us get back to exemplar. Now, Yoso is individual only insofar as he is not divided from being. Indivision and oneness in traditional metaphysics means an indivision of the being, special being, individual being, and being itself. This is what makes you one, what makes you existent, what makes you also what you are. If division is made, there is no you. You don't participate anymore in being. Now, I think you can see that this is what Kant does is not really proving that being is meaningless word. He's just snatching it away from its proper place. And now this proper place is beyond, not beyond, before any kind of subject-object division. In act of being, in being, there is no such thing, because knowing being, I would say, is also being known, but this is already leaving metaphysics towards the sphere of fate proper, fate as knowledge. But being is present in the act of knowing and the existence of known, because all knowing is knowing of something, not of nothing. Therefore, all knowing, if it is reflexive, if thinking thinks itself, if for instance Yozo is starting to contemplate his own life and who he is based on already existing knowledge. This already existing knowledge is the being of knowledge. This is what unifies your knowledge, for instance, as your knowledge, or your knowledge as knowledge of something. So this unifying factor always has to exist. On the example of Kant, you have seen how it gets maybe just shifted in other ontological contexts under the guise of annihilating it, but you cannot annihilate. You cannot annihilate some things that have to be in order for you to be. Furthermore, there are different ways to predicate being. And by predicate, I mean to explicate it in certain, let's say, individual being. And they are called categories. Being transcends all categories. Now, this is very important, and please pay attention. I'm sorry, I'm talking to you like you are students in high school, but, well, pay attention, or else. The first categories are hierarchical. First category is substance, because a substance is an answer, or ousia in Greek, is an answer to a question, what is? This is the answer, this is the basis of definition. Another categories are quality, quantity, as we call them now. Originally Aristotle called them, just put them as questions. So category of what we call quantity is answered to, I think, poion or something like that. Of what or how much, how big, or something like that. He kind of subsumes few of these quantity asking meanings into one question. Is quality and so on. Now, where is being here? It is everywhere. In each of them is an explication of being. But then, how do we know being? Being is known of the categories. It is present in all of them. Is being a substance then? As categories are hierarchical, so there is some substance before substance. No, it is not. Because this being the truth, being is neither genera nor species. It is not something. Genera is, for instance, in categorical sense, you have genera of substance. That is to say, everything that answers the question, what is, comes under genera of substance. But being transcends this, because in genera you have this aspect of difference. If you want to determine genera, you have to use species that say, for instance, I am in general of substance, a species of man. And species is something that enters genera from outside. And genera usually either denotes matter, explicates matter, or explicates something analogous to matter, where species explicates form or something analogous to form. It gives determination, it gives form to genera. But everything, you cannot have species of being and genera of being, because nothing is contrary and outside of being. And this has a lot of interesting implications. Being, crucial implications, I would say. Being is ever present means it is in all categories, while being none of them, and it is not substance. Then what is it? It is energy. I use the Greek, English form of Greek word because I love this Greek word that was coined by Aristotle, although its meaning is not something that Aristotle made up. But it says a lot. Energeia of being is pure from determinations that can be imposed upon it from anything, because it is present in everything. How then can it be known? That's a very good question. It cannot be conceptualized. You cannot have concept of it because you cannot determine it. Yet, here it is. It is, as for instance Thomas Aquinas says, the first act of knowledge. But what is interesting, it is not the first act of conscious knowledge. This is not the thing that you understand first. It is the thing that you understand first and last, because it is the beginning of all knowledge, and it is the terminus of all knowledge, of returning to coming to the apex of knowledge, is in fact returning into it, in a way resolving back into it. It is my opinion that being, knowing being is rather being known. That this is because the only way you can understand being in its traditional sense is a given, as a given, and it was understood like that, especially in when Christian theology and philosophy was developed. People came to understanding of this, because implication also is theological and traditional, but also it is a very much metaphysical implication of the being understood in this way. That it is a given, and the given has a giver by necessity. And this giver, of course, is God. And being, in short, energeia of being, is an act of creation. Whether this act, how to understand this act, you cannot really understand it in the sense that you can systematically explain it. It is completely impossible by its very nature, because it transcends the necessary confines of mind that has to use concepts. It can be conceived in a continuous sense, I would say. It is conceiving, something that you can continually conceive, but never exhaust, because it is bigger than any capability you have. But it is very important, because everything else, is based upon you being in light of it. And most appropriate image of this energeia of being is light, because everything is in the light. It is effusive of itself in all things, and it was commonly understood indeed as light. And this is the confines of metaphysics as such, that its origin, its subject is not God. Its subject is everything in the light of God's act, everything as a creation. Whereas the God cannot be understood as a subject of this intellectual knowledge at all. You are not permitted, but He is present to it. Everything you know is through His presence. And being is what this act of creation, the fundamental creation of is, that is present in all. If you don't have knowledge of this, if you don't have, let's say, if you are not open, and openness is very important to understand here, what I would call transcendentally open to this, you cannot really have real knowledge. So this is the first act. The second act is knowledge of logos or intentio in Latin. Intentio fundamentally is not intention in subjective sense. It can be, it has many meanings, but original meaning, as well as the logos, which means a word or principle and 150 other things, can be understood as a measure or a word or this or that. This is the form of any indivisible individual being, indivisible from being. And this special formality of it, the special energeia that acts through it and makes it and forms its essence, because essence is secondary to this activity, this energeia that is present here, essence is what you can intellectually grasp of it. It is energeia in intellectual mode, it is to say assimilated in the mind. It is on the basis of being. It is on the basis of fundamental createdness of things. And intentio and logos entail a purpose to everything. Everything is for a reason, for a purpose. Specific purpose that can be discerned in this or that way. And it comes to be known by being assimilated by mind. Because mind, as mind, shares in the being. With its, together with its object. By the way, traditionally object is not thing that you understand, but the form in which you understand it. For instance, object of sight is color. This is the common unity, common quality into which you understand something. So it's not something outside, like in this Kantian subject-object metaphysics. It's something that is both inside and outside, where inside and outside don't have a meaning anymore, I would say, because the medium is constantly the same. You are assimilating these forms in an intellectual way as essences. You are actualizing them in mind, because mind has ability to identify itself with what it knows. And by identifying itself, identifying comes about through activity, through energeia. It's an intellectual energeia that strips the thing known from its sensual crust, let's call it, that comes through senses to extract this essence. But essence is also a kind of knowledge that is peculiar to mind, although it is not divided from form in, let's call it, nature visible or invisible, not divided from intentio or from logos. Anyway, I already said both logos and intentio can be said in different ways. These are different modes of explicating these things. And in the mind it becomes essence. But essence is not the first. The first is this act, this energeia. Because everything is insofar as it is in energeia. It acts. It's not, nothing is. In fact, nothing is understood outside of the perspective of life, thought, and such things. Not that everything in the world is alive, but has to be. If it is to be understood from its exemplary, you better understand it through life than through dead things. Better understand everything through living or thinking things than from dead and unthinking things. This is almost diametrically opposed to our contemporary view of things. The last thing in the process of knowledge, in this schemata of mine that I devised to explain it, would be naming. things. And this is very difficult subject. So I'll be very brief, not to step where I should not step. But name is the first vocal unit of meaning. That is to say, name is the first unit of reference, of semantics. Note that predication, for instance, and explication are not really semantical. They are semantic only insofar as they use spoken and written language, because semantics is just a form to communicate, to give accidental outer form to what is inner. Today we understand predication as a reference, for instance, for using words as labels and so on and so forth. This was not originally so, because being understanding is that being is present both here and there, in subject and object. This is subject-object division is essentially not here. They are one. They are not differentiated. They are not to be taught in the terms of subject and object, but in the terms of being. And then explication is an act that does not have to be even put in words, interestingly enough, in my opinion. But the basis of all knowledge is, what I want to say, is not in language, in spoken language, but much before it. And it is not in human subjectivity, but it is in the very heart of being, that encompasses both knower and the known. And it is the basis of both. And then it gets explicated in the name. Now, the problem of how conventional the names are and problem of accuracy of different languages is very interesting thing. I will not go into it. I will just use this simplest definition of name as this vocal sign, elementary vocal sign, an elementary sign that indicates to reality. What you would call nominalism would be, especially in today's understanding, which as I said at the outset, I will use, is the idea that you can scrap everything but name and start from name. And from name to go down, not up, interestingly enough, towards the reality. The reason is because there is no accepting of the existence of natures. That is to say, nature is an active principle in every individual being that from which it forms, its logos or intentio comes from through activity of that nature, because nothing is inactive. Nature has to act if you are man. And if you don't act in according to human or man's nature, you, as this individual being, unique being, are starting to lose your human form. You cannot lose it absolutely, because you are not the one who created it in the first place, so you cannot destroy it also, you cannot dismantle it. But you are destroying its activity. The one very good example of this is the understanding of devil in Christianity. Devil, there is a question Thomas Aquinas in his pro and contra method puts, not pro and contra, but first giving the wrong assumption, for instance, that devil by nature is evil. And this seems like pretty obvious, but it is anything but. He proves that he is not, because his nature is angelic nature, and angelic nature will not be destroyed by his act of ultimate rebellion against God. What he ends up with is an absolute, eternal, infinite rebellion against its own nature. But nature is still present. He's still an angel, but he is so disfigured that he seems to exist as an opposite of angel. And this is precisely because deviation cannot escape the exemplar. Now, in our day and age, I think this is precisely the attempt to leave all exemplars. So in nominalism, for instance, you have to recreate. There is this dream, this delusion of an ability to recreate natures. So you have this political correctness, which is a very good example of it, where practically people believe that by magically using words, connecting names and verbs, that is, making this synthesis that is purely verbal, that can make a natural synthesis. They can make, for instance, men marry another man because their conception is of love is to be love is what they decide the love is, because it's not about in all these movements for liberation, anti-racism, anti-capitalism, anti-heteronormativity. It's not about good and bad. It's about freedom of will. Freedom of will that is such that will itself creates, every individual will in the end creates its own objects. So the object is not given. Will is not primarily directed towards good, but towards its own creations from this perspective. And this creation is in fact the attempt to escape any kind of confines, liberation of everything. So you have liberation from nation, for instance. You have liberation. I won't go into liberation from church. That happened a long time ago for most in highly developed societies. You have a liberation from sexual duality, which is a main constituent of human nature. It's not something that is arbitrary. It's really the main difference that is given in men. So man is always two, man and woman. But now you have attempt to erase this. Especially you can see it in these trans rights and other such movements. They are not simply movements of citizens. They are policies of very powerful Western states as a resultant of feminism. So feminists now got what they thought they weren't bargaining for, but this is exactly what they were looking for: liberation of woman from her womanhood. Of course, you cannot liberate woman from her womanhood. What you end up is men stealing the womanhood and taking advantage of this, which is kind of like, I wouldn't call it poetic, but rather tragicomic, prosaic justice on feminists. One gleam of humor in these dark times, because I have absolutely no sympathy for any of them. They got what they deserve, and it seems that they will always get people always get what they deserve in the end when they attack these fundamental things. When they attack God, I would say, in fact, but maybe that would be going too far for our subject at hand. Now, there is also one thing. Nominalism in this sense is already, we have to leave the term nominalism and maybe find something else. I would call this infraphysics, attempt infraphysica, as opposed to metaphysica, because the tendency seems to be to liberate oneself from the confines of matter, because all of this comes from assumption that being is matter. One very crude form of metaphysics, for instance, Kant's metaphysics that I mentioned, was much subtler, and now you'll see why. Materialism, of course, rejects being as any kind of meaningful word, and then, of course, takes matter as a being, because in materialism, the one that unifies everything is matter. Therefore, if I am, for instance, knowing something, what is my real knowledge is knowledge of the matter of this thing, and the knowledge in me comes about by material processes, by electronics of neural system and brains and so on. And matter is therefore one. There is one very big problem with this. Materialism is a metaphysics that relies upon extracting the category of quantity and making it self-subsistent. And this gives you a contradiction, something that Rene Guenon masterfully disclosed, of quantity being discrete and continuous. You have two forms in which quantity is in fact qualified. It is qualified as discrete, as a number, and as a magnitude, that is to say, non-discrete, extensive. So magnitude is something that you can res extensa, as Descartes would call it, is something that you can infinitely divide, whereas number is something that you cannot divide. You can divide numbers one from another, but you cannot divide number as discrete number in itself only in imagination, because it is by definition individual unit of matter. So you have to have something that is at the same instance indivisible and divisible. It's a contradictory principle. Matter is contradictory principle, as principle. Matter, there is nothing contradictory about things having a matter, but things principally being matter. That matter is the one that is uniting them. That is, that matter is the mother of all things. In metaphysical sense, is contradictory. And now I'm talking of course from anti-materialistic perspective that is in fact medieval, and I'm thinking in categories, not only expounding upon it, I'm really thinking in categories that are not modern. But I followed some of these new thinkers, some that are called, how they call them, object-oriented ontology thinkers. Reza Negarestani, some Iranian guy, Harman, and so on. Never mind. I won't go too deep into that. I'm not that well versed, and I'm not inclined to become well versed. I think they're very pretentious and not, well, going into direction that I will just explain, and it will be obvious why I'm not so interested in dwelling upon them too much. Now, what these people realized, and these are quite contemporary thinkers, is that materialism is an obstacle. They are aware of this contradiction in materialism, but moreover, they are aware of that materialism confines them. Materialism confines freedom. Of course, everybody who is religious in a proper sense of the word, or prone to metaphysics intellectually, hates materialism, because materialism is something that was imposed upon us from the 18th century, in and out, more or less. And it is very crude, for instance, but the thing is that people who still believe in natural sciences, in emancipatory power of natural sciences, always cling to materialism because it relies on what they also call physicalism, that really physics gives you appropriate explanation of things because it is looking at the very essence of matter, as if something like that could ever exist. But these people, object-oriented people, want to go beyond towards what Kant, please recall, called noumena. They want things in themselves. And they correctly notice the same discrepancy Rene Guenon saw in materialism, now this contradictory aspect of it, and that it has to be destroyed and left behind, but for a completely different purpose why tradition would destroy it. Tradition would destroy it to be able to look up. They want to destroy it to be able to look down. So, whereas metaphysics is suffering because skies are being closed in the crust of metal, let's say, and wants to pluck a hole in this crust to see the sky again, these people, I would argue, are trying to dig a hole in earth to come to the center of to reach the underworld. So it's completely opposite, and it's from the standpoint of tradition diabolic, intellectually diabolic. I wouldn't go into religious context of this. These are obviously intellect that are and wills, of course, that are moved in quite nefarious direction. Something that is exemplified by the very fact how casual they are about it. I couldn't be that casual about something as metaphysically worrisome as this idea that objects that we don't really reach things, and that we experience things in a way that is almost fascistically anthropomorphic, because we see them as what Heidegger called Zuhannenheit, something that is already at hand. We are, in fact, objectifying things, and I think you can already guess where this goes. It goes towards the idea that the next thing that should be liberated after the 13th letter has been inserted in LGBTQ and whatever else, there will be a liberation of the body parts. For instance, why would liver be subjected to my will? It's not, of course, because it's an organ, but why would it be politically dependent on my decisions? Or why would, for instance, a rock be broken by a sledgehammer if it is not aesthetically or ethically or ontologically justified? Now, this may sound crazy to you, but the idea is, and they are, as much as I can see, those people are relying a lot on Kant's transcendental philosophy. They are not stupid, because materialism is in fact a pre-Kantian position, mostly from Enlightenment French and English thinkers that are very and this analytic philosophy in 20th century is mostly on pre-Kantian positions. That this means that they were even not able to come to Kant's insights. They are very retrograde, in fact. These people are not. They understand the power of Kant and Hegel, for instance, but they, with appropriation, where they take thinking as computation. And they talk about, man, as I noticed in computer terms now, we have to reformat human being, for instance, reformat Homo sapiens or something like that. So the main drive of Hegelian subject, as they would call it, of knowledge, in a wider sense, not necessarily human knowledge, is to transcend the given. Reza Negerestani, by the way, one of those thinkers, let's call them that, thinking machines, or however they would like to put it, I don't know, systems of self-reference of Iranian origin, he said it himself, the main enemy of Geist, of spirit, in Hegelian sense, that is to say, this absolute subject who wants to synthesize knowledge, is the given. Is this in fact theological term of given being, of world being creation, is because he, the spirit, the mind, understands it as something alien and other than him, and it wants to conceive, to make a concept, to subsume everything into its system of knowledge. This is something they take from Hegel, of course, with, as they call it, Dionysian approach, where you butcher Hegel. More or less, you take forms of Hegel's philosophy and imbibe them with your ideas, because for Hegel, thinking was not computation; it was a dialectic, and dialectic, as Hegel understood it, was something that is rather opposite of computation, I would even suggest. So what this means is they are thinking, they are already not thinking of humans as humans. They are thinking in terms of self-reference. This comes from system theory and functionalist sociology. I think I never saw any one of these philosophers mention him, from Niklas Luhmann, a German sociologist. He did something very similar to them, where everything is a system. In fact, the real being of today, the being as we understand it today, this unifier, great one in all, is a system. Because system has an advantage over human knowledge, because it can relate to all knowledge and to knowledge of machines also, knowledge by machines, I mean. And form of machine knowledge, as they understand it, although it is not knowledge, is computation. It's a computer. So system, when I say that, for instance, self-reference, this is the ability of system to differentiate itself according to its needs, or needs of its existence, let's call it. This self-reference is the principle. So you don't have to have humans. Human can get obsolete in this way, and the real accomplishment would be to transcend the forms in which humans dealt with the world before, where things had purposes. First they had purposes from God, but then they had these humanistic purposes of modernity, of progress, of being zuhanden, being ready at hand to make us better. But now give this autonomy to things, to identify oneself with them, to go into this noumena that is beyond human. But this beyond, and now we are coming full circle, this beyond is in fact below, you see, because it leaves even human form, even that something of a given from the human, of ability to at least understand them as beautiful, understand them in some kind to which a human being by his nature can refer, although originally they should be considered in the light of God's act of creation as givens. This is striving to strip them of their givenness by giving them autonomy. And this is probably the last death throw of humanism, where humanism becomes anti-humanism, or as is called inhumanism. You have post-humanism, of course, but inhumanism goes even further, because post-humanism wants to develop man into something that transcends man through turning him into a non-living thing that moves and computes as a computer. But this goes even beyond that, in the sense that this means turning human. It's contradictory in itself. I'm sorry, I cannot help it. I know it sounds bizarre when I put it like I put it. Listen to them and maybe it won't sound so bizarre to you. To me it will. That you become non-thing, or a thing that has absolutely no human or non-intelligence, that has absolutely no relation to human intelligence, completely to splash or pour yourself into things, to disappear. I don't know how to explain this. I mean, there is a lot of pretentious postmodern gobbledygook in this philosophy. I take it as a phenomenon. This is in fact a kind of like free fall of the human spirit that is reaching the point of coming very close to the ground, where it will splash in a myriad of pieces. This is in fact what is occurring, and it seems to, I think, to such people that it is occurring as a speedy progress. In fact, it is a free fall. There is nothing faster than free fall. So this would be exact opposite of the exemplar from which I started. It is very interesting that you come, and I think that people, normal people, still don't understand the implications of this transgenderism, and would probably laugh when I say that you will have people that try to declare autonomy of their organs from one from another. It's something that is already along the lines, these choice of pronouns, that I can call myself we, ourselves, I'm sorry, me and she. No, I am two he's, not in a quite hetero way. I like to have a drinking buddy in my head. So these things are not funny. These things are not fad, I think. Passing fad. No. These things are even not symptoms. They are the open display of the destruction of man, that is to a large extent caused by his own adherence to lie. The lie that he is the center, and the lie that we all, children of modernity, especially us who were born in the age when modernity still was abroad, we all participate in some way, in some mode. Thank you for your attention. This was Branko Malic of Kali Tribune, signing out.